There's a moment every VR player knows. You're in a dark corridor, you can hear something behind you. You don't want to turn around, and you turn around anyway. Not because the game told you to, because your body made the decision before your brain could stop it. That's not game design, that's biology. And it's the reason horror works in VR in a way that almost nothing else does. But here's the question nobody is asking. If VR can hijack your nervous system completely, if it can make your hands shake and your breathing change, and your heart rate spike on command, why can't it do the same thing with action? Why does Resident Evil 4 VR feel like one of the best games ever made in the medium, while something like Lone Echo's combat feels like you're swinging pool noodles at the air? The answer isn't what you think, and once you hear it, you're going to look at your entire VR library differently. Horror doesn't work in VR because of jump scares. Jump scares work on a flat screen too. You don't need a headset for that. Horror works in VR because of proximity. On a flat screen, the monster is over there. It's on the other side of the glass. There is a physical barrier between you and the threat that your brain never fully stops registering even when you're immersed. Even when you're scared, some part of your nervous system knows you're sitting in a chair in a room that is safe. In VR, the monster is here, in your space, occupying the same volume of air that your body is occupying. That's not a graphical trick. That's not an audio design trick. That is your threat detection system, the oldest, deepest part of your brain, firing because something has entered your physical perimeter. You cannot logic your way out of that response. You can know it's a game. You can know nothing can hurt you, and your palms will still sweat. Horror game designers understood this instinctively. They didn't have to redesign their genre for VR. They just had to show up. The medium did the rest. Action game designers had the opposite experience. Here's what happens when you take a great flat action game and put it in VR. The encounter design falls apart. Action games are built around the assumption that the player can process threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Because on a flat screen, the camera is a god-eye view that sees everything the designer wants you to see. The HUD tells you where you're taking damage from. The minimap tells you where enemies are. The lock-on system tells you who to fight next. Strip all of that away, put the player inside the body, and the encounter design that felt thrilling becomes overwhelming. Not exciting, overwhelming. Confusing, overwhelming. You don't feel powerful in a VR action game. You feel targeted, and there's a physical layer on top of that. Swinging a sword in VR is not the same as pressing a button. Your arm gets tired, your shoulder gets tired. The weight of physical movement, the actual metabolic cost of doing the thing, changes the pacing of every encounter. Action game pacing is built around the assumption that the player can sustain input indefinitely. You can hold down the attack button for an hour. You cannot physically swing your arm for an hour, so the encounters get shorter, the enemy count drops, the intensity ceiling comes down. And the thing that makes action games feel like action games, the relentless forward pressure, the escalating chaos, the feeling that you are barely keeping up with a world that is trying to kill you, evaporates. What you're left with is a game that looks like action but feels like exercise. But here's where it gets more interesting. Because this isn't just a design problem, it's a presence problem. Horror uses presence as a weapon. The fact that you are embodied, that you are physically inside the world, is the source of the fear. The medium and the genre are perfectly aligned. Presence amplifies horror. Horror weaponizes presence. Action uses presence as a handicap. The power fantasy that drives action games, the feeling of being unstoppable, of moving through enemies like they don't exist, of executing a perfect combo that clears a room in 4 seconds, that fantasy requires a body that doesn't get tired, a body that doesn't flinch, a body that doesn't have a pain response when something gets too close to your face. Your real body does all of those things, and VR gives you your real body. So every time an action game tries to make you feel powerful, your body is quietly filing a complaint. Your arm is tired. Your spatial awareness is confused. Something flew at your face and you blinked. Empathetic. You are not Master Chief. You are a person in a room with their arms up. Horror is honest about this. Horror says you are a vulnerable human body in a dangerous world. Your limitations are the point. Your inability to fight effectively is the point. Your flinching is not a bug. It's the intended experience. Action has never learned to say that. The closest VR has come to solving this problem is in games that quietly abandoned the action fantasy and replaced it with something more honest. Boneworks figured out that physical presence works in action if you design around weight and consequence rather than speed and dominance. You don't feel like a superhero in Boneworks. You feel like a person who is very good at improvising with whatever is around them. The combat is slow by action game standards. Deliberate. Every hit matters because every hit costs something. It was one of the most critically interesting VR games ever made. It was also exhausting in a way that limited its audience. Blade and Sorcery went further. Full physics simulation, every enemy a real body that responds to real force, and the community loved it. And it never broke into mainstream VR in the way its quality deserved. Because mainstream action audiences don't want deliberate. They want fast. They want the power fantasy. They want to feel like the thing the genre has promised them for 30 years. And VR cannot deliver that promise. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way flat games can. Here's the real verdict. Horror works in VR because fear is honest. It doesn't require you to feel more powerful than you are. It requires you to feel exactly as vulnerable as you are. And a human body in a virtual space is by default vulnerable. Action fails in VR because power is a lie that requires very specific conditions to believe. Flat screens create those conditions. A controller that never gets tired. A camera that sees everything. A body that doesn't exist and therefore doesn't complain. VR strips those conditions away. And without them, the lie doesn't hold. And I think about this a lot. Because the gap between what VR action is and what it could be, that gap is not a hardware problem. It's not a processing power problem. It's not a resolution problem. It's an imagination problem. The studios building VR action games are staffed with people who grew up on flat games, who learned game design by playing flat games, who internalized 30 years of design language that assumes a body that doesn't exist. And then they sit down to build for a medium where the body is everything, and they reach for the same tools, the same encounter structures, the same pacing assumptions, the same power fantasy blueprint. It doesn't fit. It was never going to fit. The action games that will eventually work in VR, and they will come, I genuinely believe that, are the ones built by designers who stopped asking how do we port this and started asking what does this body actually want to do? Not what has it been trained to do by 30 years of controllers and keyboards. What does it actually want? Because here's something nobody talks about. When you put a first-time VR player in a headset, someone with zero gaming experience, they don't try to play like a gamer. They reach out and touch things. They lean around corners. They duck under obstacles that aren't even dangerous. They use their body the way a body is supposed to be used. And then experienced gamers put on the headset and immediately try to play it like a flat game. Standing still. Minimal movement. Looking for the UI that tells them what to do next. The medium already knows what it wants to be. The industry just keeps overriding it. They'll build a new fantasy. One that starts with the body instead of fighting it. One that makes your limitations the point. One that looks at the fact that your arm gets tired and your hands shake and you flinch when something gets too close and says yes. That's the game. That's where we start. We're not there yet. But the horror genre already found the answer. Accidentally, instinctively, just by showing up and letting the medium do what it does. It didn't fight the body, it used it. Action just has to be willing to learn from it. And so far it isn't. But I think it's getting closer. And when it finally arrives, when the first VR action game comes out that genuinely understands what this medium is capable of, it's not going to feel like an upgrade. It's going to feel like the first time.